Is a whole nother grammatical? Often one will hear the phrase that's a whole nother kettle of fish, but is nother actually grammatical? If not, what would the correct way of saying it be?
Nother used here is just a folksy synonym for another, paired with a folksy saying. It's not necessarily ungrammatical, just very informal. Some people write it with the apostrophe, like Nother, to indicate that they're explicitly contracting another. You wouldn't want to replace it in your example of a whole nother kettle of fish, because that would disrupt the folksy tone, which is the entire point of the idiom. But if you insist, a grammatical substitute would be something like an entirely different kettle of fish.
I always took this usage to be purely humorous. Certainly I've only ever used it as such. It's definitely not a contraction of a whole another, no one would say that, I hope. It's simply taking another and putting whole in the middle as if it was originally another kettle of fish, which of course we know it's not. The correct version is simply a whole other. Edit, some more discussion on this here, a whole nother way of looking at things.
Actually, this is an example of what's called a tmesis. It is the insertion of a word into another word. In a whole nother, the ga and the nother go together and the whole is slotted between them. It is exactly the same process you get with the common, but more vulgar. Abso-fucking-lutely or gun-be-fucking-leavable. For a humorous take on the subject, XKCD. Regarding a whole other. A whole other gives a very common formulation. It is perfectly fine, use it if you wish. A whole nother gives a very common formulation. It is perfectly fine, use it if you wish. The thing about a whole other is that it's actually quite strange. According to eddiemonline.com, it was way back in the 13th century that in other was combined into another a. Another is now a separate word in its own right. In fact, it is the word of choice. You will rarely find another thing. Another thing is pervasive. That's the thing about a whole nother. It isn't the mistaken analysis that you have gay and another. It's the insertion of one word whole into a second, single word another a. And that second word is another a with an en. This process intensifies another a. Compare. Here's another apple. Here we are talking about an apple. It is much like all the other apples that have been discussed. Our speaker is pointing out an unremarkable apple, an apple like many others before it. It's just another one. Here's a whole nother apple. Now we have a very different kind of apple. Perhaps, before, we only had red apples, but now we have a green apple. This isn't just another apple, like its fellows, this is a whole nother apple. In reality, you'd be more likely to have something like, here's another apple, points to an apple, and then, here's a whole nother fruit, points to an orange. A whole other gives a different process. What is the difference? A whole other gives like fucking unbelievable. A whole nother gives like unbe-fucking-leavable. With a whole other a, then, we have a whole nother thing going on. Firstly, we have another separated again into a and a other, as it was prior to the 13th century. We also have a whole qualifying other a. This is a little unusual. Consider, for example, the whole other a. There's nothing wrong with this, but this has fallen out of fashion. A whole other gives quite a new formulation, relatively speaking, and one can't fail to notice that it's rare to have words qualifying other a. We could have the good other books, but we prefer not to. We prefer the other good books or the other good books did. In the first case we have books that are good, like the other ones, and in the second we have books that are good, unlike the other ones. This may explain why a whole nother comes along shortly after a whole other, as Acuponti explains. So, a whole other gives a very common formulation. It is perfectly fine, use it if you wish. In fact, I find both a whole other and a whole nother very interesting, very cool, very valuable bits of English. I don't much have a problem with either of them. But to argue that a whole other must be grammatically correct, because the word is the other, not another, seems to me to be a mistake. In fact, the word is the another a. And the insertion of whole into another is a process relating to word formation, to vocabulary, not to grammar. Admittedly, though, the spelling a whole nother is a little bit of a red herring. A whole nother would be more revealing.
Ultimately, a whole nother is the reverse case of an unwashed apron. Some English speakers treat another as a compressed version of nother rather than of an other, and the adjective whole simply slips in between the presumed article a and the presumed noun nother. The opposite split is on display in the case of an unwashed apron. Napron arrived in Middle English from the Middle French word napperin, a diminutive of nape, cloth, according to Merriam-Webster's 11th Collegiate Dictionary, 2003. But owing to what the 11th Collegiate calls false division of a napperin, English speakers produce an apron. The adjective unwashed then slips into place between the revised article and the revised noun apron. because the not her is making its way in a relatively literate world crowded with written guides to and interpretations of proper English. It doesn't have as easy a path to acceptance before it as an apron did, but the process in spoken English is much the same, I think, except that here the false division yields a instead of an as the associated indefinite article. A somewhat similar operation underlies the US dialect word druthers, meaning preferences, which seems to have come into existence at the end of a process in which I'd rather was altered by the southern Appalachian pronunciation of rather as ruther, and then rebroken as I'd druther.
If you want to support the channel, please consider liking and subscribing.